right, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining me on this Pandemic Wednesday. Glad you could be part of the show today. As always, thank you for your dedication, your education, and showing up today. Today was it's going to be a really interesting episode. It's going to feel like maybe the darkest episode we've ever had. I decided to, rather than just state things in a timeline, to almost kind of tell it like a story. So that's kind of going to be the approach to this, and it's really a horror story. I mean, if you were a parent, this is like watching your worst nightmare horror movie, right? And so that's going to feel how it is. However, if you hang in there, it's kind of got a little inspirational ending. So make sure you stick to the end to find out what happens. So I labeled this the parent's nightmare virus. Now, if you were an adult tuning in and watching this show, whether it's live or later on, you can probably kind of guess what virus we're talking about now. But I kind of wanted to tell the story and build the suspense a little bit. So let's get going, right? So this story starts in 1894, right? So let's rewind time back to the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age is a period of time of like great industry leaders, tycoons, right? All this huge industry achievements. But you're starting to see the nasty underbelly. Remember back to like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle that we had to read in class, where it was like they had this meatpacking plant, and of course y'all read about the gory, nasty details of what was really going on behind the scenes at some of these meatpacking plants. You see who was the guy? The guy that had all the pictures. Trying to think of who that was. Anyway, the pictures of New York City, or I'm sorry, Chicago, that had all the people just kind of suffering in the streets. A lot of child labor. It's really it's one of those, like, on the surface it looks like everything is just booming society, but underneath there's like this nasty underbelly. The Gilded Age actually comes from a quote from Mark Twain, where he says, "The golden gleam of the gilded surface hides the cheapness of the metal underneath." And I thought that's a great way to kind of quote the era of the time, right? We have the automobile, but don't look at you ever heard the expression, don't look a gift horse in the mouth? And that's kind of what's going on, right? Like this great innovation going on with the automobile, but don't pay attention to the child working in the sweatshop to help. Jacob Riis, that's it. Thank you for that. Jacob Riis, right? The guy that worked with Teddy Roosevelt. I'm so glad you were paying attention in class. Thank you for that. And by the way, let me give the shout-outs too. Thank you, Quinn, for showing up. Thank you, Nirali. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Davius. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. Glad you could join us today. So, very poor treatment of labor, but it feels like everything on the surface is doing really well. Okay, so that kind of gives you an idea of the climate of the country. So, kind of going back to the beginning of the school year, how was labor being treated during the Gilded Age? Give me some examples if you can remember. Remember Jacob Riis, how the other side lives, and of course Upton Sinclair's The Jungle were the two I provided. Go back to those images. What were some things you remembered about how labor was being treated during the Gilded Age? And leave your comments below. Okay, so in the summer of Vermont, a small disease outbreak would happen, right? And this is kind of unusual. A lot of diseases, not all, but a lot of them will typically weaken during the summer. But whatever this disease was, doesn't. For some reason, it seems to enjoy the summer, right? Now, this disease would break out in Vermont, and they don't know what it is. Of course, we don't have modern science. There's no electron microscopes or anything like that. They just know there's an outbreak of some new virus, disease thing in Vermont at the time. Now, the symptoms seem very mild. They basically include sore throat, a fever, some abdominal issues, maybe nausea, vomiting, stuff like that. Maybe some constipation, maybe even in some cases diarrhea. Right? So it's like a stomach virus. If you've ever had a stomach virus that maybe gives you some fever and stuff like that. In some cases, it would even escalate to flu-like symptoms, but those were very rare. So nobody really thought of this as being a huge problem It's not national news. It would be local news in Vermont, but not national news. See, he says they were living in bad situations and working conditions were unsatisfactory and safe. Yeah, if you go back to remember, he talked about how like when they were working in the meat packing plant, they would take old meat and mix it in with new meat, or they would take meat that had been off the floor and mix it in. People were working long hours. Children were working 14-hour days. Yeah, it's just absolutely crazy. So this is a kind of disease that falls under the radar, but it's the first case we have of this outbreak of this disease, right? So, kind of the question I asked was, before COVID-19, did you go to the doctor every time you got sick? And I know I don't, right? Like, if it's just a fever or small cold, I'm not going to the doctor. Thank you, Jayla, for showing up. So, the kind of question is, would you go to the doctor, right? If you're just running a light fever, maybe 101, maybe got an upset stomach, are you the type of person that goes to the doctor every time you're sick? And I'm not. Maybe we should be. Maybe we should be that type of society, particularly now that we know the danger of pandemics. But unfortunately, I am not that type of person that does such a thing. So, and by the way, that was not the case in Vermont. The average person, if they get sick, it's not going to be until it's, looks serious that they're going to go to the hospital. So we don't quite know how big the scope. The rats that would poo in the food. That's right. But yeah, we don't know. No, my insurance sucks. Yeah, that's the thing, right? The cost. But yeah, so this is an era in which, the average person's not going to go to the hospital. So we're not even sure how big the outbreak is. I think there's like 130 reported cases. So it's not something people are really panicking about at this point. 1905, a Swedish scientist by the name of Ivar Wickman would discover some startling discoveries about this virus. The disease is mostly asymptomatic, right? So that means the vast majority of people that get whatever this disease was in Vermont had no symptoms. Now, they could carry the disease, but they didn't know it, right? Think about one of the things that made COVID-19 so dangerous is you could have it and go days, sometimes a week, sometimes you can go to whole life with a virus and never know it. And it gets worse. Many diseases do this one, but this one is really contagious to children. They're very vulnerable to it. Okay? Here's where it gets to be. This is why I call it the nightmare virus. Symptoms are discovered that although the disease starts in your intestinal system, it would often get into your bloodstream. And when it does that, it would attack your nervous system. All of a sudden, it was discovered that this was a disease that the vast majority of it would affect children, and it would leave them paralyzed from the waist down. Okay? Wherever it would attack your vertebrae in your spine, you were paralyzed from that vertebrae down, right? So this was a disease that its biggest symptom was paralyzing small children. Now, I want to kind of give you, and I asked the question, have you ever been around somebody in a wheelchair and what was it like? I kind of want to give you a little background on myself. When I was 10 years old, I had a 7-year-old little brother, and he and I got in this really nasty fight, and then he goes back into his room, and I'm doing my homework, and then I hear my dad yelling at my brother to wake up, and it turns out he had slipped into a coma, and he would spend the next couple months in a medically induced coma before waking up. And I'm not going to get into the scientific specifics, but basically, and he didn't have polio, the disease that we're talking about. He didn't have that. But when he would wake up, he would be paralyzed from the waist down for the remainder of his life. And he ends up passing away when he was 21. Huge impact on me. I can't think of somebody had a bigger impact on me as a person. But anyway, when he, growing up in my household from that point on, I had a brother that was in a wheelchair. And if you've ever been around somebody in a wheelchair, you kind of realize that, even the people that would be around him, it's like they would experience it and they would get a taste of that life, and then they would go home. If you live in a household with somebody that's in a wheelchair or been around somebody a lot, you kind of start to realize, like, it never ends. Think of it this way, and I guess the closest thing I could think of is like if you were to live as a minority in a very racist society in history, of that, like, there's never a day in which you don't have to worry about it. It's that kind of feeling, right? And thank you for saying that. But, Mr. Raby, But it's one of those situations where it's like, if you go to the movies, you have to think, well, can I go to the movies? Where can I sit? How can I park? If you go to a grocery store, you have to think, well, how am I going to get the groceries and blah blah blah. So it's one of those things like, no matter what you do, it has to be on your mind, right? In everything, right? If you go to a theme park, can I go on the rides? You're never able to escape it for a single day, right? And for a parent, it's exponentially worse, right? So remember some of the things that would upset my parents the most. My brother was in a Boy Scout troop, and they decided at the end of the year one year to have they foregoed the annual camping trip and decided to have a roller skating party. Well, how do you do that if you're in a wheelchair? And it's little things like that that's like it's constantly, you're never allowed to stop worrying, right? And there's also, and I'm sorry I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, there's also all these additional medical problems that just kind of happen fluidly from having that happen, right? It's always going on, always happening, right? So anyway, now the disease is going to be named poliomyelitis. Poliomyelitis, I think that's how you say it. It comes from the Greek word meaning gray and marrow. So basically, it's kind of talking about the gray marrow that it attacks in your spinal column. And people would eventually just kind of shorten the name down to polio. Now, maybe you've heard polio, maybe you've not. I did mention in class this would be, and thank you for joining us, Thomas. This would be the disease, and I'm going to talk about it in a second, but this would actually be the disease that would attack Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So in 1901, at the Rockefeller Institute of Medical Research in New York, a doctor by the name of Simon Flexner made a huge discovery. He discovered, I'm sorry. There we go. That was the question I put up there for y'all to answer. I'm sorry. I'm not sure how far back I left it on the webcam view, or if I ever turned off the webcam view. Let me just kind of show you the slides real fast. But those are the pictures of the children that were stricken with polio. Here's another little girl. And so, it's just such a heartbreaking disease, right? Because, your number one goal of a parent is to protect your kids, right? And this is like the ultimate attack against your kids, right? Then this guy Simon Flexner just makes a huge discovery that's going to be huge later on. He found that this disease was present in the blood of monkeys that had survived polio injections. So they had kind of a working understanding of vaccines. They had kind of discovered it with smallpox. They didn't understand the full scope of it, but they discovered that at least in this monkey that they had injected it with, it was still present in their bloodstream, right? So other researchers reported similar results with humans. And basically the thing is, these substances were neutralizing antibodies to polio. So your body has natural antibodies, right? So you get a disease, you recover from it, and you're immune to it. For whatever reason, people were not becoming immune to this disease, right? So why is it so important for your body to develop immunity? And, the kind of thing I kind of want to stress is, and maybe you don't know this, you actually never get the same flu twice, right? It never happens. So why do you sit there and go, well, that doesn't make any sense, Mr. Walter. I've had the flu, 4 or 5 times in my life, right? What'll happen is you'll get the flu, and then the flu mutates. It'll be a new strain, right? Which is why you have to get the new flu shot every year for the latest batch of this year's strain of the flu virus. And it's important that your body be able to develop immunity. For one, it allows vaccines to work. The second one, too, is if your body did not develop immunity, you would literally get sick of every disease that has ever existed, right? Mankind could not survive. So, now, I want to go back in time all the way back to the early 1900s, right? The automobile has been invented, but it's still brand new. The average person does not have an automobile. So it's almost like we're practicing social distancing, but not because it's a national policy. It's just a condition of society, right? It just is a condition, right? So the disease didn't really have the means to spread the way it would now, right? Like you couldn't just hop on a plane and fly to New York, right? Right. So exactly right. Y'all all sitting there saying the same thing, right? You get disease from all the different stuff you've ever had disease before. Absolutely. Oh, and by the way, thank you for joining us, Kira, and thank you for joining us. Okay, never mind. That's the only person I didn't get a shout out. So, what factors make spreading disease so much easier today? What are ways diseases spread today that is way easier? And by the way, this is an airborne disease, which is, even scarier. Airborne diseases are the worst. But what are some ways? What are some ways that? Think about it. Let's go back in 1910. What are ways in which our technology today has made COVID-19 so much more dangerous than if it had happened in 1890? Right, we travel, right? So, I can hop on a plane. Like, we know this started in Wuhan province in China. You go back to the 1910s, it may have taken a decade to get here. It took a few weeks to get here, months maybe. So, yeah, it protects us from disease caused by bacteria. Absolutely. So, and then you think about it too, like, we have cars, so we can travel around and spread it that way. So we're just so much, and there's more people. Right? Our medical breakthroughs have allowed so many more people to live to spread diseases, right? Less than 6 feet. People go out frequently, right? Now, unlike many diseases, the summertime seemed to have no impact on this virus. By the summer of 1916, it had made it to New York. Okay? Now, even in 1916, the population of New York was over 5.6 million people living there. Right, that's bigger than Houston today. So it's really dangerous when you have this. And of course, you can see this is New York. People cram together down in the streets, right? So it's going to start spreading like wildfire. Now, due to the close proximity, polio is all over the place in New York. More than 2,000 people in New York would die alone, and thousands more would become paralyzed. Many of them are children. In fact, they began posting up signs telling people to keep their children out of New York. Right? So if you had kids, get the kids out. Right? Now, one of the things you got to realize, and of course it's still true today, New York is a business hub. It's a culture hub. People are coming and going out of New York constantly. So it's like once it gets to New York, it's like the beginning of the end. From New York, it filters out to everywhere. It's almost like a disease getting into your heart and then it gets into your bloodstream, right? It's kind of like that. That same year, another 6,000 cases will be diagnosed that summer, with thousands more losing the use of their legs, right? So, of course, you can see this hospital filled with children that can't walk anymore. I mean, and I tell you, if you've ever been around little kids that can't walk, oh, it's gut-wrenching. It's absolutely gut-wrenching. So painful, right? So, what can we do now to help stop the spread of pandemics that maybe we couldn't have before? Of course, you can think about things like we have the N95 masks, social distancing, vaccines, all kinds of stuff, right? Maybe I'm leaving some out. What are some things we can do today that helps us with pandemics that maybe we couldn't have done back in 1910? Getting information out, right? Like I'm sitting here today talking to y'all on the internet about how to help fight diseases. You couldn't have done that back in 1910. You couldn't log on the internet and get up-to-date information. So what are some ways that today we can stop a pandemic that we couldn't have before? Yeah, online ordering. That's a great point, right? So it used to be I would have to go to the local market and get food. Now I can order it online. We've been using that Walmart curbside pickup. That's a great point. So good stuff, absolutely. Now, disease will continue to have outbreaks. Now, keep in mind, it started in the late 1800s. Okay? In 1921, a former New York State Senator and Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, would come down with the illness, and he would secretly lose the use of his legs. And I wanted y'all to see this. This is kind of interesting. Hold on.
This campaign is one of confidence in leadership. Confidence in leaders.
presidential campaigns are now featured on newsreels. A national leader's image is more important than ever before. Roosevelt appears to be an energetic candidate. Actually, he has something to hide. Years earlier, at the age of 39, Roosevelt contracted polio, which left his legs partially paralyzed. He fears people won't vote for him if they know the truth about his condition. At Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C., Senators pitcher Jimmy DeShawn captures this very rare footage of FDR walking with his leg braces.
Yeah, he would use braces to lock his legs in place because he couldn't walk.
Ultimately, FDR comes to an agreement with the press. No photos of him walking or getting in and out of cars. This footage shows the security detail signaling for the cameras to cut as FDR prepares to leave his car.
Okay. And my question for this was, why do you think FDR hid his condition? Why do you think he hid it? I don't know why it does that. All right. So why do you think he hid his condition? So leave your comment in the section below. And for me, I just think about it's the wanting to look like a proud, strong leader in front of the country. Particularly, got to realize during the middle of the war. Yeah, and by the way, once you lose, because it's damage to your spine. Once polio gets you and you can't walk, there ain't no going back. That's right. Okay, so in 1929, a guy named Philip Drinker, a PhD, and a guy named Charles McCann at Boston Children's Hospital, scared nobody to vote for him, at Harvard published a paper successfully describing the use of an artificial respirator for patients suffering from paralytic polio. The Drinker machine would eventually be later called the iron lung, and it would provide temporary and in some cases permanent breathing support for people suffering from paralysis. So imagine having to live with this thing right here helping you breathe. It would basically work your diaphragm and allow your muscles, which are essential for respiration. This breakthrough would be a huge advancement in saving lives, but the disease continues on, and his parents living in fear. Right? I can't imagine. To me, this sounds like a parental boogeyman. Right? What do you mean? There's this invisible disease going around that just leaves children paralyzed or stuck in this thing for the rest of their life. Right. So the iron lung was not a cure, but at least it bought time. Right? It bought people more time on this earth to live. So here's the question, and think about it this way, and I want you to put yourself in the mindset, and I know not everybody listening to this is a parent, right? But put yourself in that mindset of, what do you think it would be like to see your kid sitting in that iron lung, knowing that even if they come out of it, they're probably never going to walk again? You can just imagine, of all the diseases. Of course, we've gone through some horrible pandemics, right? Like I talked about the Spanish flu. I've talked about the Justinian flu, so on and so forth, right? But this one, I think, is the scariest, right? Like if you ask me which was the scariest disease we've talked about, boy, this one scares me. Because all I can sit there and think about is having to see my kids go through what my brother went through. It's absolutely gut-wrenchingly scary, right? So an Australian researcher by the name of Frank M. Burnett and a guy named John McNamara decided to infect monkeys with polio from a fatal human case of the disease. Y'all making a good point. Heart attack, devastated and angry, so sad, absolutely. Now, the monkeys had recovered from a previous case of polio yet were paralyzed by the new infection. So this is where we start to learn, wait a minute. There's more than one strain. This thing has mutated. There's now at least 2 strains of polio that are doing the same thing, but this new strain is even more deadly with worse symptoms, right? So it's like the nightmares come true. Maybe we'll never figure out a vaccine for this. Their work showed that there was more than one type of polio virus, and that the previous infection to one did not offer immunity to the other. So it's like the worst nightmare comes true, right? So we've been fighting this disease now for 40 years, and it's getting worse. So why do you think will impact us if COVID-19 virus mutates to a more deadly virus strain? And, that's one of the things that is kind of left off the table when we talk about this. Dealing with the pandemic of COVID-19 is not just about flattening the curves. Don't get me wrong, we need to do that. But one of the things that's also dangerous too is, what if this thing mutates? We have been very lucky so far that it has not seemed to affect children. What if it was? What if it went after children the same way it went after the elderly? Right now, if you're over 65 and have a pre-existing health condition, which a lot of elderly people do, the mortality rate of it is like 18% of them die. Imagine if 18% of babies and small children are dying. Imagine the nightmare if you're a parent, if that's the case. So one of the things that is so important that we whip this thing in the butt is that we don't want it to stick around and mutate. That it could get less dangerous, but it could get more dangerous too. It's a heck of a gamble, right? So in 1935, 2 separate teams began to work on developing and testing a polio vaccine. They challenged the New York Institute, and they challenged the Temple University in Philadelphia. I think the current America will have a permanent scar if the virus mutates. Yeah, it could be the end of American civilization. I mean, it really could. Horrible for everybody. Absolutely. Now, in New York, a guy named Maurice Brody would prepare a killed polio virus. So that's how we knew about vaccines. You would just kill the virus and inject the dead virus. They began testing on chimpanzees, and they had some good success, right? So finally he injects it on himself and then children, right? So that's kind of how the stage works. You test it on animals, you test it on humans. He would inject some 11,000 individuals in both control and vaccine groups of his trial. Meanwhile, a guy named John Culmer of Temple did the same thing. He came to the same conclusion. He got a dead version of the polio virus, began injecting it as a vaccine, and he injected about 10,000 children. It is a disaster. The test proved worse than you could imagine. Subjects began contracting. Apparently the virus was not dead, and all these children that they had injected that did not have polio are now starting to show signs of being paralyzed or ill or suffer allergic reactions to the vaccine. Okay, so here is somebody that, that they subjected their children to get a vaccine thinking this vaccine is going to be the thing that makes it where you get to sleep at night confident that your child's not going to ever get polio, and it turns out you were injecting your kid with polio. So one of the things I ask is, why does this show the importance of proper testing and not rushing to put out a medicine? There has been several things that we've seen recently that were suggested as potential cures or treatments for COVID-19. Some very recently that were very dangerous. And this kind of, the thing I kind of wanted to point out was, this is why we go through the testing. Things like this, right? I mean, imagine it was your kid, right? You take your kid and they're like, hey, we got a clinically tested, we test on monkeys, we think it's good. Come bring your kid up, get them tested, get them the polio vaccine. You give it to your kid, and next thing you know, your kid can't walk anymore. I mean, imagine how you would feel as a parent. So, I think this is a huge cautionary tale for the importance of proper medical testing. At the Rockefeller Institute in New York, they demonstrated that a new cultivation method for the polio virus. Yeah, it shows that there could be more than harm done than good. That's right. because it shows how if you're not careful and don't take care of your time, you can hurt the lives of others. Absolutely. All good stuff. Take time, make safe medicine. Good stuff. So anyway, they're able to grow the virus in a human embryonic brain tissue. Okay, so this would lead to an immediate practical application. And the big thing about this is it's going to make it cheaper and stuff like that, right? So in 1938, an enormous fundraising effort began when an actor named Eddie Cantor suggested on the radio that, look, everybody's panicking about coronavirus. Why don't everybody just send 10 cents? Of course, by today's standards, that'd be like $1, right? So it'd be like me saying today, look, everybody just send $1 to help out, right? To help fight polio. Within a few weeks, people had mailed over $2,680,000 worth of dimes to the president. Okay, and keep in mind, with inflation, that's like, $2 billion, say. So other celebrities began to organize around this grassroots campaign and began calling themselves the March of Dimes. And maybe you've heard of the March of Dimes, but they end up raising tens of millions of dollars towards an effort to find a cure for polio virus. And the question I kind of ask is, do you have a favorite charity? Whether it's trying to think of some of the good ones. I know the March of Dimes is good. Let me see. What are some of the best? Best charities to donate to. Humane Society, breast cancer research. I know that I told you all about Thorn, that helps fight human trafficking. Scholarship organizations. Teach America. Like some of y'all remember City Year, right? They work off donations. Let's see. The Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. The ACLU, Americans for Civil Liberties Union. I've actually donated to them. I'm not familiar with WWF. What does WWF stand for? Let's see. The National Alliance to End Homelessness. American Wildlife Foundation. That's a good one. Let's see. Mental Health America. Yeah, there's a lot of them, right? I'm just kind of curious. I've never heard of WWF. I'm assuming you don't mean the World Wrestling Federation. UNICEF. That's a good one. UNICEF, and that is I'm trying to see what the acronym stands for. I know it's a humanitarian one. The United Nations Children's Fund. I'm not sure what UNICEF. WWF is wildlife. Okay, right. I'm assuming you weren't talking about donating to the wrestling organization. Alright, so when the virus was first discovered, it was believed to be a virus that attacked the digestive system. Over time, that changed, and people started believing, no, this actually attacks the nervous system. In 1941, they discovered they were both right. It does attack the digestive system. However, as the virus gets in your digestive system, it would begin to seep out, and that's when it attacked the nervous system. So that would be huge in figuring out a way to treat it. So in 1941, President FDR would begin using his fireside chats that he'd used to gather support for World War II, right? Remember, we showed some of those. And he begins to beg America for help. Please, if you're a scientist, get to work on this. If you can, donate money. And you got to realize this is something that really hits home for him, right? I mean, it's something that affected him. And he's watching children go through what he went through. It was heartbreaking. And this is this weird moment where you see a president begging his people for help. It's a really fascinating moment in history. And here's one of the quotes I had is, the dreaded disease that we battle at home, like the enemy we battle abroad, which he's talking about World War II, shows no concern, no pity for the young. It strikes with its frequent and devastating force against children. And that is why much of the future strength for America depends upon the success that we achieve in combating this disease. So my question is, why do you think this is such a big deal for the president to ask for help from his people? Right? Can you imagine, and let's just go back in recent presidents, can you imagine Donald Trump getting on TV and just begging people for help? Please, please help me. Or Obama just begging the people, please help me out. The closest thing I can think of that I've seen is here recently we saw Governor Edwards just begging people, please stay at home. Of course, they didn't. But just begging people to stay at home. So that was kind of my question. Is, when I think about it, the ability to humble yourself. This guy's the most powerful man on the planet, and he's begging people for help. That speaks volumes. And it shows how serious the situation is. That's absolutely right. So, meanwhile in Boston, a team of a guy named John Enders and Thomas Weller and Frederick Robbins showed that they could grow polio viruses in various tissue, human embryonic skin and muscle tissue. Now, this does two things. One, it saves lots of money. But two, it means they don't have to test in monkeys anymore. And this kind of brings up another question. So it's a little off topic, but, what are your thoughts on animal testing? Let's see. It shows how serious the situation was because he's going through what the kids went through. That's absolutely right. I used to have this lesson in psychology when I was teaching psychology where I would bring up the issue of animal testing. And I would bring up the case of, do you think it's okay? And it was funny because I would show videos and footage and talk about really the horrors of animal testing. And by the time I was done, I had a class about 15 that were taking psychology. And when I was done, every one of those students were all in unanimous agreement, no, we don't need to be animal testing. That is terrible, it's horrible, you can't do it, right? And then I actually bring up this real world case that actually was something that we went through. And I said, let me ask you this. Okay, hypothetically. Imagine if, here's the thing I said, imagine that there was a means to cure spines, right? Let's say somebody had spinal damage and they were paralyzed from the waist down. But the only way to find the cure for it was to break cats' spines and see if you could repair them, right? And almost everybody's like, no, that's horrible, right? And I said, but let me ask you this. Imagine this. Imagine you had a child that was, let's say, 10 years old, and they're wheeling around and they're in a wheelchair, and every night they're going to bed asking, mommy or daddy, why can everybody else walk and I can't? Why did this happen to me? And it's really ripping your heart out. And then somebody came along and said, well, we might could cure your kid, but to do so, we're going to have to break a lot of cats' spines. And when you put it in that context, it's like, at least in my class that time, every single one of them said, well, that's different, right? If I got to break a cat's spine to save my kid and make sure that they're not in a wheelchair, well, that's different. And I kind of said, I was somebody that as a kid, I actually very stupidly ran out into traffic to save a kitten. It was super dumb. And I had that cat for, 15, 16 years before it died of old age. So, I'm somebody that's definitely, put myself in harm's way thing, right? But, I even said, look, even that cat, me personally, this is how I feel about it. If I had to sacrifice that cat for my brother, I would have done it in a heartbeat. So it's a really very difficult issue, right? It's not black and white. Hopefully, and it seems like we're moving out of the stages of needing to do that, right? So maybe we'll come to a world in which we never have to do it. But it's not an easy one, right? Obviously, I personally don't believe about it for cosmetic reasons, but I don't know. It's a tough issue. I can't definitively say where I stand on it. So a guy named David Brodian, a PhD, and somebody named Isabel Morgan are researchers at Johns Hopkins. Sydney, make sure you hang tight afterwards. I need to talk to you about the AP test, so hang tight afterwards. So anyway, people from Johns Hopkins, and by the way, thank you for joining us, Sydney, published a paper identifying 3 types of polio virus. So now it's discovered that, look, if we come up with a vaccine, we're going to need 3 different viruses covered in one vaccine. So in 1952, a guy named William M. Hammond, MD, from the University of Pittsburgh, researcher, would begin testing injections of antibodies from other common infections, right? Similar diseases and stuff like that, seeing if that would work, right? They began using tests using a double-blind placebo-controlled effect, and it's one of the first of its kind, where you give some people the cure and you give some people pretend versions of the cure to see if it's actually curing it or if it's something else. Now, the trial showed that it did produce temporary immunity, right? You could give this weakened version of a similar virus to people, and they would have a temporary immunity to polio. However, it's way too expensive and way too difficult to produce. It's quoted as saying it takes almost a pint of blood, on average, just to make one shot for one person. And we're talking about only immunity for about 6 months. There's just not enough blood on the planet to make it a viable option, right? You got to have humans and humans producing blood. So it just ends up, even if we could afford it, which we could not, we don't have enough blood to mass produce it. So it's not going to work. So why do you think this, it's supposed to say, it says demoralizing. It's supposed to be demoralizing. Why do you think this non-cure would be so demoralizing? And I think for me it's this thing of like, you start getting this feeling of like, what if there is no cure? What if there is no cure? You know, like what if we never figure out a way to solve this? You know, here we come along, we finally found a cure and it turns out there's no way we could do this in a way in which it works. So leave your comments about why do you think this particular non-cure would be so demoralizing? So, in 1952, 57,628 polio cases are reported. More than 21,000 of them are paralyzed. Okay, so it's getting crazy. Imagine you just woke up tomorrow, 21,000 children walk around without the use of their legs. This epidemic highlighted parents' fears of the disease and focused public awareness that people are starting to get fed up and they want a cure and they want it tomorrow. So in 1952, a guy named Jonas Edward Salk, a researcher out of the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine, began trials of a new cure that took weakened or dead parts of the virus and injected them into resident children in institutes for the physically and intellectually disabled. Now, what are your thoughts on him testing this new cure? Now, keep in mind, remember, he is also kind of rushing to testing, right? Yeah, one of the last polio survivors in Ireland. Yeah, we actually talked about that earlier. Yeah, and so, you know, the thing I think about, it's like, imagine you were to do this today. Like, hey, I've got this vaccine, but let me go find the mentally handicapped children and test it on them first. You know, it just seems, I don't know, a little barbaric, if you will. You definitely couldn't do that today, because immediately people are like, wait a minute, what makes them being mentally handicapped mean their lives have any less value? So yeah, you could never get away with doing that today, but he did. And, you know, this is where, you know, up until this point, you would inject a single virus to give yourself the cure. This is the first time you ever saw somebody using a weakened or dead version, which is, by the way, how we do vaccines today, as a means of giving somebody the virus, right? So after some medical reports suggested that a polio vaccine was nearly ready, because it works, right? He gives it to these kids and it's working. However, we're far away from being able to mass produce this virus, right? So what's going to happen is this guy Salk is going to get on the radio and he's basically going to tell people like, look, we have a cure, but don't expect it anytime soon. It's going to be possibly years, right? Even now, like it would probably take about 12 months to a year, to 18 months to have a mass-produced vaccine for COVID-19. So that's something we're worried about. Hopefully we can fast track it. Although progress has been more rapid than any had the right to expect, this is his quote, although progress had been more rapid than any had any right to expect, there will be no vaccine available for widespread use for the next polio season. So people start getting angry at him, right? And he actually ends up getting it on the left and the right. People are angry at him on the left because they say he's seeking attention. That almost like he has the cure, but he's holding on to it so he can get more fame. And then from the right, from conservatives, we start seeing the kind of rise of the anti-vaxxer thing, right? And I didn't even know about this until I researched it. But you can kind of understand their fear, right? Of, wait a minute, we've already seen this experiment, it didn't work. You're not going to inject my kid with the virus. Yeah, somebody's been playing Plague. That's right. So, to give these people hope and to ease their fear, to make them realize, like, look, we do have a cure, it's working, he decides to inject himself, his wife, and all 3 of his sons with this new vaccine. So my question is, would you have that kind of courage, right? You think you have a vaccine, you've done your clinical trials, and it's working. Would you have the guts to put your money where your mouth is, kind of, and inject yourself and your whole family? I don't know that I could. That was pretty gutsy. But he ends up injecting his entire family with the vaccine. And of course they are. They're all immune to polio. It's working. Of course, he took bits and parts of all 3 of the viruses in a weakened or broken up dead state and injected it, and people were getting immunity to it. Yeah, I'd do anything to save my family, but boy, I'd be scared doing it. So the Vaccine Advisory Committee approved field test of Salk's polio vaccine. Trials would begin the next day with vaccinations of thousands of school children. In all, over 1.3 million children participate in the trial. And it works. It works. These children now are immune to polio. 80 to 90% of them are completely immune to polio, right? That is huge, right? I mean, you talk about flattening the curve. 80 to 90%. So on April 12th, 1955, it was announced the results of the virus vaccine. This paved the way for widespread, next pandemic is the T virus. I don't think people in here might know that. That's the virus that causes the zombies in Resident Evil. Anyway, this paves the way for widespread distribution and use of the vaccine. And by the way, how many of your teachers would know that? I just thought I'd point that out. That would be nerdy enough to know what the T virus was. Alright, so how do you think parents felt about seeing this new vaccine? And me, boy, you talk about it, it would feel like God himself had come down and blessed me. That I get to go to bed at night never having to worry about my child losing the use of their legs. So, I mean, just what a sigh of relief. It's like the nightmare is lifting, right? So just a few weeks after the success of the vaccine trials, an Idaho doctor reported a case of polio in a recently vaccinated girl. And this is going to be called the Cutter scare. So immediately everybody's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Wait a minute. Somebody who was vaccinated ended up coming out with polio? Turns out the Cutter laboratories in California had cut corners in making their vaccine. As far as I understand it, the way it works is they use formaldehyde to weaken the virus or kill it, and then they inject the weakened or dead strain. It turns out they didn't use the right mixture. They were trying to cut corners, and they had not weakened the virus enough. And they ended up giving, yeah, I am such a dork. They end up giving kids the virus, right? So it's not that the vaccine is bad. It's that the Cutter Institute was cutting corners. Why do you think this would be a huge setback? And the first thing I think is, if I'm a parent and I find out that the vaccine might give my kid the disease, even I would be like, I don't know about this. Because how do I know the other companies aren't cutting corners? You know, I mean, we don't have the FDA yet. There's nothing regulating these centers that make sure they're not cutting corners. You know, so I'll be honest, it would panic me too. You know, so now you got people that really don't want to inject their kids with the vaccine. So, in a shocking turn of events, this is where I kind of want to end it on a happy ending, because this blows my mind. Jonas Salk would decide to make all of his research available to the public. Now, he could have gone and patented it, right? This is not a guy working for some giant institution. This is a guy who was a researcher. He could have gone out and personally patented it. Today, he would be his family would be multi-billionaires. I mean, think about it today. Every kid, everybody watching this, to be able to go to public school, y'all got a polio vaccination. Think how much money he could have made off this. I mean, he would have been he might be Jeff Bezos rich. Everybody on this planet has to have a polio vaccination, right? He could have made so much money off this, right? But he didn't. He said, you know what, it's not worth it. I don't want to make money. I want to make sure all these companies don't have to worry about money when trying to produce vaccines. I want to make sure we get rid of polio. That's my primary. And by the way, his family's already vaccinated. They're already immune to it. So he's not saving his family. He just wants mankind to get rid of this disease, right? Wow. The thing is, could you give up that kind of money? Could you give up being one of the richest people on the planet? Which, by the way, he's not rich. I mean, his family, they don't go on to be rich. Could you give up being one of the richest people on the planet in order to help people very quickly get their hands on the vaccine? Man, you talk about temptation. Unbelievable temptation. Noel says he wants the money. By the way, thank you for joining us, Noel. Yeah, you talk about... Whew, and I sit there and think about that little twerp, and I can't think of his name, that has the patent for insulin, and how he's jacking up the price of insulin and causing people to die just because he can. Because people have to have it to survive. Not a fan of that guy at all. He's the polar opposite of this guy right here. Boy, that'd be tough. I would like to think I could, right? I'd like to think that, especially knowing it's children, that I'd go, we don't have time for me to stop and make money off this. I need to make sure that the vaccine is available for the world. Now, the fact that he did this mostly on his own, so he didn't have a huge reputation in the science community. He was not part of some major institute. He wasn't part of a think tank or something like that. And the fact that he got so much personal fame, right? Had, let's say, John Hopkins or something like this pulled this off, the university gets all the fame. In this scenario, he's getting all the fame, right? Not the institution. He himself is getting all the fame. And when he makes this thing public, he really becomes famous, right? And I think there's a lot to be said about this. Why? But he'll never even get nominated for a Nobel. Doesn't even get nominated. You can make the argument this is one of the most life-saving discoveries in human history, the modern vaccine. That you could make this argument that this man alone has saved more lives than anybody else in human history. You could make that argument. And he's not even nominated for a Nobel. Not even nominated. And a large part of it is, I think there was a lot of people that were angry, and this is kind of the question I said is, why do you think he was shunned by the medical community? And I think there was a lot of issues. I think there was the issue of, it kind of makes them look bad. If you have a major medical breakthrough and you invest all this work, you want to get rich off of it, right? And I get that. But it makes it look real bad when this guy basically is sitting on the golden goose and he just gives it away. So it makes it really hard for you to not look like a monster, like the insulin twerp that's jacking up insulin, to not look like a monster when you do it. And I think there's also the aspect of who is this guy? He just kind of got lucky type mentality, right? He wasn't part of some prestigious society. He wasn't running big circles. It would be like if somebody just kind of came out of the crowd and hopped in an NBA game and was all of a sudden, the best player in the NBA. You'd have a lot of people that were like, where'd this kid come from? He didn't work to get up here. And envy. I think there's a big part of that too, right? The fact that he was so famous, and a lot of people are like, wait a minute, we worked. We put in contributions. We were trying to cure this too. So I think there was that aspect of it too. The number of worldwide polio cases has fallen by an estimate from estimates in that's supposed to say 1898. I got those two numbers backwards. In 1898, matter of fact, let me change that now just to make sure. Just for the future. Oops. Anyway, in 1898, it had gone from 350,000 to 2013. There was only 407 cases on the planet. Wow, that's huge. A decline of more than 99% of cases. Right? There's still rare cases out there of people contracting polio. 4 regions of the world are completely polio-free. There is not a single reported case of polio in any of the Americas, not in Europe, not in Southeast Asia, and not in the Western Pacific. That's huge. Okay, to kind of show you 1988 versus 2008. Look at that. Right? Look at the huge success rate they've had. So, one of the reasons it's so important to vaccinate is that there could still be strains of the virus. Polio could still be out there, right? It could still be out there. What we have to do is make sure that thing does not survive. So, one of the reasons why it's so important to have a vaccination is we don't need to have this thing mutate. The kind of question I ask is, what would be the impact if polio did mutate, right, to a form in which we couldn't find a vaccine for? As terrible as COVID-19 has been, it's been horrible. Can you imagine if instead of having to sit at home, because otherwise you might go get your grandma sick, imagine if, half of y'all reading this section were having to fear losing the loss of your legs. That's this kind of thing I think about is, what do we do if this thing mutates? Polio mutates. It's still out there. So it's, it ends on a happy note. It looks like on the most part we have cured polio, right? On the most part. But I always kind of point this out as this is why it's so important to vaccinate. We need to keep it cured. We don't need this thing hanging around and mutating. So, but yeah, so that was it for today. Scary virus, scary stuff, but again, happy ending. Polio is finito. So that's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for your dedication to education. I appreciate you showing up. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section of this chat. Real fast, I'm going to leave some, while y'all are writing possible questions, I'm going to say some stuff. This is really just for Sydney, since she's in my AP class, but I want to make sure she hears this. The AP test is on the 15th of May. It'll probably be the best chance you will ever have to pass the AP test. Really, really fantastic opportunity here. It's only going to be 45 minutes and one question, and it's going to be whatever you want to use. Internet, you name it, right? Don't copy and paste, but whatever you want to use. They have announced that for everybody that gets a passing grade, which is a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, for everybody that gets a passing grade, they get $100. They're going to randomly give out $10 gift cards during the test. If you just take the test, you get your a letter grade bump. Let's see what else. And if you, by the way, you're going to have to check your email. What's going to happen is they're going to send you a link in your email. So you're going to have to log on May 15th at 1 o'clock and take the test. You're only going to have 45 minutes, and they're not going to give you a timer. So you're going to have to use your own timer, probably for like 40 minutes, and submit it. So I'm going to be posting stuff in y'all's Google Classroom. Make sure you pay attention to it, because this is a beautiful opportunity to get a passing grade on that AP test. So anyway, that's going to do it for me. Sydney, if you have any additional questions, feel free to ask them on Remind or Google Classroom, however you want to ask. But please make sure you take that test. So that's going to do it for me. Let's see. Well, I'm glad you do not. Thank you for not copying and pasting. And that's going to do it for me today on this episode of Wall Dropping History. Thank you so much for your dedication to your education. And until next time.